Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. In this podcast, I am going to be talking about a number of different types of third worldism. As you all know, I imagine, I am a Maoist third worldist, but there are other kinds of third worldism as well. And I draw upon many of them in addition to Maoism, third worldism, such as world systems analysis and critical pedagogy. But what I will be doing here is surveying briefly some of these different third world isms, trying to make sense out of them, and then going on to the next one. So if you notice any delays in this podcast, it's because I am going through my book. I will put a link to that book below this podcast, below the video, so you can go there. The section of the book that I'm drawing upon is referred to as global Southernism. That's a term that I coined myself. Because it refers to the global South. These days, I might change it to third worldism. In fact, I might go back at some point and do that, but not now. So if you want to find more information on the things that I am discussing, go to the book, which is linked below this video, and follow the link under the pop-down menu for global Southernism. That is a very, I think, comprehensive text, mostly compilation on Marxism and different types of Marxism. I do need to revise it. There are some things that I now think are errors in it, but I just haven't gotten around to it. But I will sooner or later. So be prepared. But anyway, so I'm going to look away from the camera for most of this podcast because I will be looking at the book. And again, if you notice delays in the middle of the podcast, it is because I am scrolling down through the book. Okay. I think that'll make it easier because I want to read certain sections of it. And if I just talk extemporaneously this time, that might not work. So I will, in effect, deviate from my usual convention of talking off the top of my head, of improvising, to relying more on a book. But it is a book that I wrote. So I would hope that all of you, when you get a chance, will go there and we'll explore the book for yourselves. Okay, I'm now at the book. So again, if I am looking away from you at times, that is because I am reading through the book. These are some of the different types of third worldisms that I have in the book. First is dependency theory. And I'll read you what I wrote here. I wrote that according to dependency theory, resources or capitalist profits are redistributed from the periphery, which refers to undeveloped countries, essentially the third world, to the core, which are developed countries. Now, the dependency school or dependency theory, both which mean the same thing, has been in decline for a number of years. That does not mean there aren't still dependency theorists out there. There are, but not as much as there were before. Why? Not exactly sure. Maybe some other approaches have come along that theorists and researchers think work better. but factually, it has been in decline now for a number of years. So let me go ahead and read a couple of things to you, and then we'll go on to the next theory below this. Dependency theory explains underdevelopment throughout Latin America, and not only Latin America, also Africa, as a consequence of outside political and economic influence. More specifically, the economy of certain nations is believed to be conditioned by the relationship to another economy which is dominant and capable of expanding and developing. Thus, the interdependence of such economies assumes contrasting forms of dominance and dependence, so that dependent nations might develop as a reflection of the expansion of dominant nations, or underdevelop as a consequence of their subjective relation, meaning it may be to the advantage of some first world nations that third world nations do not develop. That's basically what it's saying, I think. Second quotation, again, on dependency theory or the dependency school. One significant contribution of the entire representatives of the dependency school of thought is that some 2 decades later, their intellectual prophecy that warned of the dangers of economic growth patterned after the West had come to be appreciated with subdued silence in Africa just before the end of the 20th century. The worry of the dependency theorists became an embodiment of the goals, aspirations, and expectations in the struggle for self-determination, self-sufficiency, and self-reliance in the third world countries, determination to legitimize and assert their political and economic independence. So what that quotation, I think, is talking about is that many third world countries have tried to become independent of the core countries, meaning many countries that were dependent on the core countries have tried to no longer be dependent upon them. We've seen that happening throughout the 20th century, and perhaps a bit into the 21st century. We see that with decolonialism, the gradual breakup of empires, of colonial empires, such as the British Empire, such as the French Empire, and so on. Read you one more quotation, then we'll go on. Dependency theorists have been mired in a theoretical impasse since the mid-1980s because they cannot explain the economic achievements of newly industrializing countries. In the information technology industry, a key sector is the knowledge-based economy, the knowledge economy, like high tech, things like that. The high-tech industrialization and performance of India and Taiwan are particularly noteworthy. Ironically, however, the rise of knowledge makes these countries more technologically dependent. In other words, that although perhaps countries have tried to become independent of core countries by establishing their own technologies, many of the sources, many of the component parts, for instance, of those technologies come from countries that are already developed, such as China, for example. And so in striving for more independence, they have, in effect, also been experiencing more interdependence, more reliance upon core countries. So in other words, that it hasn't necessarily worked out for them in the way they anticipated. Let me continue with that quotation. According to our research, the original dependency theory is regaining its potency in the new age because the knowledge gap between industrial and industrializing countries has become wider or remains wide. Data tells us that hardware Taiwan and software India have grown rapidly in the global IT information technology industry, a typical sector in the knowledge-intensive epoch. Scholars have tried to analyze these cases so as to provide lessons for others. However, thanks to the widening knowledge fracture, the economic development of these countries strangely parallels more technological dependence. And this is the great irony. Not even Taiwan, and India even less so, can catch up with the advanced economies technologically. We doubt that other developing countries can escape from the cruel fate to which they seem doomed. That's the end of the quotation, but let me give you a small bit of commentary on that. In terms of carbon emissions, there have been attempts to curb carbon emissions globally because obviously they pose a threat to our survival on the planet. By our, I mean human beings. Whether we as human beings can survive past the 21st century has a question mark after it. No one really knows. It is possible, maybe likely, I don't know, that we may literally develop ourselves, technologically develop ourselves out of existence. So, when India, for example, has been asked to curb its technological development as well, its response has been perhaps understandable, but sad. What India has said is, look, you countries in the first world, the US, Canada, Western Europe, and so on, you developed through carbon emissions. You developed by air pollution. How do you expect us to develop if not by the same means? And although that is a sad argument, it is an understandable one. I can understand if I were living in a country like that, I might think, well, what else can we do? We need to get ahead. We have just as much of a right to become economically successful as the US and Europe, and yet we are not right now. So why shouldn't we have the same right that those countries did to engage in pollution, which refers to excessive carbon emissions? And it's hard to argue against that. I would like to argue against it, but it's really difficult to do so. Now, what I just read you is a simple summary of what the dependency school is. It is not the complete thing. There are a number of different factions of the dependency school. Different, meaning there are different dependency theories in the dependency school. And not all of them see exactly eye to eye. But they all see enough eye to eye to be classified under the same basic heading of the dependency school. So you have different theories, different dependency theories, which all operate within the dependency school. Next, world systems analysis, sometimes called world systems theory. Although the guy who developed it, Immanuel Wallerstein, does not like that term, world systems theory. He insists on calling it world systems analysis. His argument is that it's not a theory. It's a way of doing methodological analysis, of literally analyzing the way the capitalist world system has developed. And Wallerstein is the guy who coined that term, capitalist world system, and from which I have derived the term communist world system, or perhaps socialist world system, either one, pretty much the same thing. So what Wallerstein has said is that the capitalist world system is now in a state of decline, severe decline, and that he expects the capitalist world system to be over within the next couple of decades. Now, obviously, he's not a prophet, neither am I, so he has no idea of what will replace it. I have tentatively proposed, again, the title communist or socialist world system, but that's just my own idea. But no one really knows. But what is clear is that the capitalist world system is in a state of decline. So now, let me read you a couple of quotations, actually 3 quotations, by Immanuel Wallerstein on world systems analysis. The modern world system in which we are living is that of a capitalist world economy, is currently a crisis and has been for a while now. The crisis may go on for 25 to 50 years. He wrote that back in 2004. That's why he's updated that and says that maybe we have 20 to 25 years left of the capitalist world system at this point. Since one central feature of such a transitional period is that we face wild oscillations of all those structures and processes we have come to know as an inherent part of the existing world system. And again, by that he means the capitalist world system. We find that our short-term expectations are necessarily quite unstable. This instability can lead to considerable anxiety and therefore violence as people try to preserve acquired privileges and hierarchical rank in a very unstable situation. In general, this process can lead to social conflicts that take a quite unpleasant form. So I guess you could say that Immanuel Wallerstein, when it comes to the capitalist world system, is definitely not an optimist. Okay. Second quotation, also by Wallerstein. The key difference between a developmentalist and a world systems perspective is in the point of departure, the unit of analysis. A developmental perspective assumes that the unit within which social action principally occurs is a politico-cultural unit, a culture that is both political and cultural. The state or nation or people, and seeks to explain differences between these units, including why their economies are different. A world system perspective assumes, by contrast, that social action takes place in an entity within which there is an ongoing division of labor and seeks to discover empirically. It's really a key word. He puts empirically in italics because world systems analysis is a type of empirical analysis. So let me start with that sentence again. A world system perspective assumes, by contrast, that social action takes place in an entity which there is an ongoing division of labor and seeks to discover empirically whether such an entity is or is not unified politically or culturally, asking theoretically also in italics, what are the consequences of the existence or non-existence of such unity? Okay, final quotation, again from Wallerstein. Social science has been Eurocentric throughout its institutional history, which means there have been departments teaching social science within university systems. This is not in the least surprising. Social science is a product of the modern world system, the capitalist world system, and Eurocentrism is constitutive of the geoculture of the modern world. Furthermore, as an institutional structure, social science originated largely in Europe. We shall be using Europe here more as a cultural than a cartographical example, meaning an example based on maps, expression. In this sense, in the discussion about the last 2 centuries, we are referring primarily and jointly to Europe and North America. Okay. So his term Eurocentrism, certainly a perfectly valid term. It is a term that I would generally call first worldism. Is there a significant difference between the two? Not that I can tell. I think they are basically synonyms which describe essentially the same basic framework. Now, the problem, as I see it, with using the term Eurocentrism, which is okay, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the term Eurocentrism, is that it leaves out countries that are not in Europe or North America. What about, for example, New Zealand? What about Australia? What about Japan? Certainly, those countries are in the first world, but they're not in Europe. They're not in North America. So I think that the term first worldism is a much clearer term for describing what I think Wallerstein intends, if I can read his mind, which obviously I can't, by the term Eurocentrism. Okay, so that's basically a brief summation of world systems analysis, which was developed by Immanuel Wallerstein. Now, the interesting thing, the good thing, I guess you could say, about world systems analysis is that Wallerstein publishes an open access journal. That means you don't have to subscribe to it. You can simply go to the website and log on. In fact, I will include a link to that website below this video so that you can get there and read articles in that journal if you like. It's a very interesting journal. Do I agree with all of it? No, but I do agree with some of it. Now, one final note. World systems analysis grew out of dependency theory. It was an attempt to turn dependency theory from a theory to a method of analysis. Therefore, some people I'm not sure how accurate that is, but some people incorporate world systems analysis into the dependency school. And you can make an argument for doing that. But most scholars do not. Most scholars put the dependency school and world systems analysis in two separate categories. And I think that makes the most sense. At least it does to me. Maybe not to you, but at least to me. Now, going to my own perspective, Maoism, third worldism, which I have recently, in order to combine two frameworks that I have I'm using, started calling socialism from below, third worldism, with heterodox Maoism in parentheses, but means the same thing. This perspective, like world systems analysis, was also very strongly influenced by the dependency school. The dependency school has been very, very influential throughout the social sciences and beyond the social sciences. It's been a really, really powerful, intellectually powerful school of thought in academia. And therefore, because of that, a lot of people, not only sociologists like Wallerstein is, like I am, have used aspects of world systems, the world systems perspective, or the dependency theory school, whatever you want to call it, and Maoism, third worldism, my own perspective, also incorporates aspects again of the dependency school. Okay, so this approach, I'm reading what I have written down here, focuses on revolution originating in the third world. I imagine most of you know that by now if you've been listening to me. Let me read you just a couple of things that might further clarify what this is and how it works. This is taken from an organization, and I'm not even sure if that organization exists anymore. It might, I don't know, called the Conscious Fighters Vanguard. They are a Maoist third worldist, or were a Maoist third worldist organization. This is a quotation directly from their literature. There's no, actually there is an author given. The author given is Comrade Red Raw, obviously a pseudonym. Cease the global military industrial occupation, super exploitive offensive, and proxy puppet lackey opposition. Gee, those are some difficult words to get past. Perpetrated by the first world against the third world. Oppressed and exploited people of all countries take up an internationalist stance in direct opposition to U.S. imperialist aggression. Yay. Amen. I agree 100%. Form a twofold united domestic, international, and anti-imperialist liberation front operating counter to A, the super profiteering of outsourced sweatshop labor, B, the expropriation and depletion of natural resources, and the subsequent environmental devastation, C, the eternal debt and mandatory privatized structural adjustments imposed by the likes of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And finally, D, the repeated political bombings of any economic developments the underdeveloped nations attempt to make. O starved of the earth. Poetic, eh? Splinter, shatter, shake this neo-colonialist, monopolist yoke, people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, lay down your chains. Remnants of kind of like the quoting from Marx. Take back your land, dignity, and culture. Throw the Yankee imperialists out. I love that. The phrasing of that inspires my heart. Let me read two more quotations, and both of them are from Comrade Red Raw. First one is more like a poem. It's written like in verse. Nobody likes me. Everybody loves me. Guess I'm gonna get eaten by worms. Scatter the ashes. Better before they can rape my 82-course corpse. Honestly, I've tried to figure that out, and I'm not convinced that I have. I think I have an idea of what Comrade Red Raw is saying, but I'm not entirely convinced. So I'll be honest with you. I read that over and over again. Is he talking about literally getting eaten by worms, or is that a metaphor for something? I don't know. But it's colorful, so I thought I would read it anyway, even though I don't necessarily understand it now. Then, finally, again by Comrade Red Raw. In a revolution, revolutionary culture exists before, during, and after the revolution. Presently, we're at the stage of pre-revolution, i.e., cultural revolution. Thus, we promote the artwork. In parentheses, he has posters, philosophy, poetry, stencils, murals, music, film, etc. Close parentheses. Of the conscious fighter's vanguard. This is a method of raising people's political consciousness, what I would prefer to call conscientization, as you know. It is only after a significant level of consciousness has been raised that we can move to the next phase away from purely cultural revolution to revolution by intensified means. I love that. I love that. If you are not a Maoist third worldist, maybe you can't appreciate that. But as a Maoist third worldist, I mean, I read what Comrade Red Raw is writing, and I think, you know, if that guy were here, I'd hug him. I would hug him. That is so spectacular to me. But hey, you know, that's my own immediate reaction to what Comrade Red Raw said. He is certainly not the only Maoist third worldist out there. The most important Maoist third worldist in the world today, in my opinion, is Jason Unruh, a brilliant man, an autodidact, self-taught man, in other words, but not self-taught for long, not entirely self-taught for long. The little hint without spilling the beans. And he is so eloquent in his phrasing, and his style of presentation is so spectacular. If you do not subscribe to Jason Unruh's channel, Unruh spelled UNRUH, on YouTube. I strongly suggest that you do. Now, are all of Jason's videos specifically on Maoism, Third Worldism? No. For that matter, neither are mine. Although they all have some influence of Maoism, Third Worldism. They all don't necessarily focus precisely on that. Also, Comrade Nicole, Red Pagan Nicole. She also has a channel. Her channel is called Red Pagan Corner. Also a Maoist, Third Worldist channel on YouTube. And I would suggest that you also join her channel. Let me spell that out for you. Red Pagan, one word. Corner, one word. Type those into the search box on YouTube and you'll find it. She is a wonderful woman. She is a trans woman. So in addition to being an advocate for Maoism, Third Worldism, she is an advocate for trans rights, which indeed she should be. I mean, I support trans rights too, and I'm not trans, but I still support trans rights. I've always supported trans rights and gay rights and lesbian rights and bisexual rights and asexual rights and whatever. I support the rights of everyone. Well, unless they're trying to hurt people. But Nicole is a great woman, and I would strongly suggest, and a close personal friend, and I would strongly suggest that you subscribe to her channel, as well as to Jason Unruh's channel. Oh, and by the way, if you have not subscribed to my channel yet, in addition to liking this video, below the video, please subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking that out of any kind of monetary goals. I will never accept any money on this channel. I don't need it. I am wealthy, too wealthy for my own good. I am very wealthy. And it was purely fortuitous, purely happenstance. But regardless, I am wealthy. I don't need your money. Find somebody who is needy. Find somebody who is poor. Find a cause that is worthy of your support. Support Jason Unruh, for example. Support Comrade Nicole. They both have pages on Patreon. Go to their Patreon pages and support them. Don't support me. First of all, there's no way to support me. There's no link on YouTube to go take you to any support page, but don't try looking for it because no such page exists. But yes, support Jason and support Nicole. Do not support me because I am evil. No, not evil, but I don't need your money. I genuinely do not need your money. And I think that money is a valuable thing in this world, in the capitalist system anyway. And if we have it, and some people don't, then we should give it to those people who don't, as much as we can. And that is what I do. I have a collection of people that I give money to. And it is always good to help people who need it. And it is never good to ask other people to help you if you don't need it, which is why I don't ask. So yes, support Jason, support Nicole, but by all means, by every ounce of strength in your being, do not support Mark Foster. Colorful, eh? Maybe not. Okay. Next type of third worldism. This is critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy was developed by the late Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian educator in the 20th century. He developed an approach to education that he called critical pedagogy. Pedagogy is simply a term for the art of teaching or the art of education. Teaching understood as an art, which it is. And I've seen a lot of people try to master it, and they've not done a very good job. I hope I did a good job. I tried to, but I've seen a lot of people who tried to do well at it, and I have seen samples of their teaching, and I wondered why they were even trying. But that wasn't for me to say. I was not their dean, so I had no authority over them. Okay. What critical pedagogy is interesting, and I'll kind of outline it in a kind of roundabout way. Paulo Freire was in many ways very similar in disposition to theologians of liberation theologians. So there is similarity between critical pedagogy and liberation theology. The reason why is because both of them rely upon Roman Catholicism, and both of them rely upon Marxism. So they are both attempts to fuse Marxism and Roman Catholicism together. Now, they have changed since then. There are some liberation theologians who are not Roman Catholic. There are some who are Protestant. There are some who are Jews. There are some who are feminist, which I don't exactly understand because feminism is not a religion, but there are. I imagine they can explain it a bit better than I could. But that's the similarity. And so there is a parallel between critical pedagogy and theologies, usually pluralized because there are many different ones, and some of them are very distinct theologies of liberation. Both of them are emancipatory perspectives to their own respective fields. Critical pedagogy is an emancipatory perspective to education. The theologies of liberation are emancipatory perspectives toward Christian theology, and occasionally some other types of theology as well. Now, the idea of liberation theology or theologies of liberation was not appreciated by the first pope that I personally remember, who was Pope Paul. Now, he wasn't the pope when I was born, but he's the first pope that I remember. And I know he did not like the theologies of liberation. So he actually forbade them. And most theologians of liberation were Jesuits. Jesuits have traditionally been like the young upstarts in the Roman Catholic priesthood. They even their head is called the Black Pope, just to show how basically how much they attempt to challenge the norm, to challenge the status quo, which they do. But has liberation theology gone away? No, it hasn't even entirely gone away from Roman Catholicism. Now, can Roman Catholic priests legally, I guess, maybe legally isn't the right word, do it? I guess technically not. But not all Roman Catholics, in fact, most Roman Catholics are not priests. And so they can do it. I mean, you can't threaten a non-priest with being fired. And these theologians of liberation were literally threatened with being fired. Their basic idea was that Jesus was the great emancipator and that he should be seen in that light. And so when Marx talked about liberation, that is extremely compatible in their view with Jesus. Because Jesus not only, in their view, emancipated people spiritually, but he also emancipated people economically. There is a passage, I believe it's at the end of the book of Mark, but don't hold me to that, where it talks about how all the members of a particular community sold everything that they owned, and they gave the money that they made to the poor, and they lived collectively or communally. What a wonderful story. That is literally a teaching of communism. In the Gospels do not teach capitalism. Believe me, they don't. Ignore what your cleric says. They do not. If anything, the Gospels teach communism. Communism is very plainly discussed, I believe, in the book of Mark, but if not the book of Mark, one of the other Gospels. But I'm pretty sure it is the book of Mark. Okay, let's leave theologies of liberation and move on to the more relevant topic, the more third worldist topic of critical pedagogy. The aspects of critical pedagogy that I have been emphasizing throughout this podcast, especially throughout season 2 of this podcast, is conscientization. Now, where did Paulo Freire get that term from? Well, he got it from the French word, even though he was Portuguese, he wasn't French, but he got it from the French word conscience. See, I can pronounce French, conscience. And the French word conscience can be translated in two ways. Well, it's spelled like the word conscience, so it can be translated as conscience. But it can also be translated as consciousness. There is no French cognate for consciousness. I mean, you can say consciousness in other ways in French, just like you can say consciousness in other ways in English, like awareness, cognizance, whatever. But there is no cognate for consciousness in French. And so in French, the word conscience means both conscience and consciousness, those two things together. So what Freire is talking about is a kind of critical conscience and consciousness raising activity. That's Marxist. I mean, that's what Marxism is, right? About raising people's conscience and consciousness. At least that's what I think it is, especially in the third world. That's my understanding of it. That's what I try to do. That's what my heart is attached to, literally. My heart is literally attached to the concept of conscientization. If I were to lose conscientization, I genuinely feel that I would lose my heart. I don't see that I could have a heart. And I'm not talking about the muscle in my chest. I'm talking about the emotional muscle. I don't see how I could have that emotional muscle, that emotional center, without conscientization, as Freire called it. And so it's good that he coined that term. It's useful. And he coined it in an educational context. Freire was primarily a secondary school teacher. Now, personally, since I'm a retired college professor and a retired university professor before that, I would like to be able to say that he was a retired college or university professor, but that's kind of selfish. I realize that. I feel like that would bring him closer to me. So it's not entirely selfish. But he was not that. He was not a professor. He was a high school teacher. And he genuinely used critical pedagogy and its primary methodology of conscientization as a mechanism for raising the consciousness of the people that he thought were oppressed. And he tried to bring them out of that oppression as best he could. So that is another type of third worldism. Getting excited yet? Okay, we haven't, and I'm skipping over a lot of them, by the way. I'm not covering all of them, which is why I would encourage you to follow the link to this book and then to go to the under the drop-down menu, Global Southernism, so you can read about the rest if you would like to. The next, also a variation of pedagogy, but this is called pedagogies of resistance. But Patricia Perkins, person who coined the term, she discusses specific initiatives that were taken in Brazil to establish something like Freire's critical pedagogy. Let me read you a quotation from her, a book that was, actually it's a book that is a collection of articles. This paper discusses Brazilian initiatives and models for community-based environmental education, pedagogies of resistance, which are using the democratic opening provided by the watershed-based legal structures to overcome cynicism and demonstrate the value of grassroots participation in water decision-making about water policy. There is a burgeoning theoretical literature, including the work of third world theorists, on the potential and value of such organized subaltern movement. So again, there, like I have, she is using Antonio Gramsci's term, the subaltern. At both theoretical and practical levels, these examples from Brazil offer insight and hope about the potential of women's grassroots networks to help us build women-friendly democratic processes in Brazil and globally. Very nice. I like that. I like the way she says that. In a way, it's kind of a repetition of pedagogy of the oppressed. So at first I was inclined to skip it. When I read it again, I said, no, I can't skip that. I just can't skip that. I have to read what she said. I'm happy I did. Okay. Another type of third worldism, wouldn't you know it? Theater of the oppressed. This is from, and I'm not going to most likely be pronouncing this correctly, so I apologize for my mispronunciation. I do have an MP3 audio file which does pronounce it, but from past experience, when I played these, they do not carry over well onto, well, through the microphone. So I will do my best and most likely fail at pronouncing the guy's name. Augusto Boal. His last name is spelled B-O-A-L. Okay. Boal's approach to theatrical performance as a theatrical director, which is what he was, explains in the book Theater of the Oppressed, was influenced by fellow Brazilian Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy. Okay, now, I'm going to read you a few quotations that deal with Theater of the Oppressed. And so to give you a basic understanding of what it is, and so none of these quotations, well, actually, one of the quotations is by Boal, but the other two are not. The first quotation is not. A Marxist artist must promote the movement toward national liberation and toward the liberation of the classes oppressed in capital. That is by Augusto Boal. Okay. Believe it or not, I was wrong. The next quotation is also by Augusto Boal. See how fallible I am? I am so fallible. The oppressed people are liberated themselves and once more making the theater on their own. The walls must be torn down. First, the spectator, the audience, starts acting again. Invisible theater, forum theater, image theater, etc. Secondly, it is necessary to eliminate the private property of the characters by the individual actors, and they call that, for some reason that is not entirely clear to me, the Joker system. Maybe one of you might know, but I don't understand why they call that the Joker system. Okay, now this next quotation is also by Augusto Boal. Okay, one after it is not, but this one is. The oppressed people are liberated themselves and once more are making the theater their own. Nice. The walls must be torn down. First, the spectator starts acting again, which is kind of what he said before. Invisible theater, forum theater, image theater, etc. Okay. So, in a sense, he's repeating what he said in the first quotation, but it's in a somewhat different context. Let me read the final quotation, which is not by Boal. It is by John Sullivan and Juan Parras. As Augusto Boal claims, quote, the art of transforming, I always say, transforms she, he who acts. Theater of the Oppressed sees the theater as a rehearsal for the transformation of reality. An ideal forum leaves actors, spectators, and audience energized, motivated, actively vigilant, and dissatisfied with the reality they've seen portrayed on stage. Paulo Freire calls this a state of patient impatience. Nice term, isn't it? Patient impatience. But Boal is less ambiguous. There is no place for passivity at a forum, Boal says. theater of the oppressed, prime spectators to apply their powers of critical awareness to deconstruct what they see and prepare for action and on the world. So, in other words, it is basically a third worldist approach to the theater. In a sense, as somebody who used to be in the theater, I actually did a TV commercial once upon a time. I've also been in a lot of plays, and I used to be a professional ventriloquist as well, which is one of the aspects of my life that I tried to hide. Ooh, I just unhid it. But in a way, it appears to me that theater of the oppressed is kind of an expression of improvisational theater. When I was in theater school at the Theater Academy of New York City, the people who ran that school were Hal and Ruth Persons. Yes, you heard me right. Their last name literally was Persons. And they were brilliant theater teachers. They used method acting, Lee Strasberg's method acting. In fact, they were former students of Lee Strasberg, and they attended his little theater. But they started their own school as well, which was a wonderful school. And Hal and Ruth placed most of the emphasis on improvisation, because to them, if we can improvise when given a few key terms, we're told a situation, we're told that we have this role, and that's it. You let it fly. I loved it. I was always tempted to violate the norm of improvisational theater. The norm is that when the first actor sets the stage, literally sets the stage, that you don't deviate from that. You accept that, and you remain within the confines of what that person did. I was always tempted, but I never did it, to criticize that, kind of attack what the person did, and to reset the stage myself. But I knew that if I did that, well, Hal and Ruth wouldn't literally yell at me. They didn't yell at people, but they would be really annoyed at me. And I liked Hal and Ruth, and I didn't want them annoyed at me. So I followed the rules. And that's pretty standard in improvisational theater. So it appears to me, although I could be wrong, because I have never actually studied theater of the oppressed. I've read about it, but I haven't studied it. That theater of the oppressed is kind of an application of improvisational theater to a third world context. So basically enacting the roles and the situations of people who are in the third world. It's a wonderful idea. I loved it. Unfortunately, not being in the third world, I never had any opportunity to take part in it. To my knowledge, there is no formal theater. Maybe informally there is, but there is no formal theater of the oppressed in the US. I could be wrong. I actually looked around for it and I couldn't find anything. But that was a long time ago. That was back in the 1970s. I am so old. I'm too old. But I couldn't find anything. So eventually I simply gave up. Whether I should have can be debated. Okay. Next. We're almost at the end, but not quite. Consciencism. Sounds a bit like conscientization, doesn't it? Conscienceism. This was developed by a person, and again, I'm probably going to botch the pronunciation of his name, and I apologize to him and to his family and to anybody who knows how to pronounce it correctly. Kwame Nkrumah. That's the best I can do, and I'm sorry, I probably did not pronounce that correctly. But again, if I try pronouncing it on MP3, my experience is that you will not hear it. So be it. I'll read you, actually, I think I'll read you like four or five different quotations by Nkrumah. Because they're all good. Revolution has two aspects. Revolution is a revolution against an old order. And it is also a contest for a new order. The Marxist emphasis on the determining force of the material circumstances of life is correct. But I would like to give great emphasis to the determining power of ideology. A revolutionary ideology is not merely negative. It is not a mere conceptual reputation of a dying social order, but a positive, creative theory, the guiding light of the emerging social order. What a great writer he is, isn't he? Great writer. Next quotation. Philosophical conscientism does not assert the sole reality of matter. Rather, it asserts the primary reality of matter. If space were absolute and independent, matter could not, with respect to it, be primary. Therefore, philosophical conscientism, in asserting the primary existence of matter, also maintains that space must, to the extent that it is real, I love that word real, derive its properties from those of matter through a categorical conversion. And since the properties of space are geometrical, then follows from philosophical conscientism that the geometry of space is determined by the properties of matter. That is really brilliant. I'm not sure that I entirely agree with every aspect of it, but I mean, you read that thing, all I can do is think of how brilliant the guy is. You know, any personal critique I might want to make of what he said, I can't make it right now because I'm just too impressed by what he wrote. So a critique is gonna have to wait. If I ever make a critique of conscientism, which I have not yet so far, and it's for that reason, because I'm so impressed by this guy's work. Maybe I will, but not yet. Next quotation, again from Nkrumah. But if philosophical conscientism connects knowledge with action, it is still necessary to inquire whether it conceives this connection as a purely mechanistic one, or whether it makes it susceptible to ethical influence and comment. That is really important, because if we approach matter without an ethical or moral framework, which is basically what Roy Bhaskar says with his moral realism, then who cares? Who cares? Because how could we possibly know what we should do with that matter? How could we know what it is for? I mean, the matter speaks its reality to us. all we need to do is to listen. I realize that might sound too postmodern. I didn't mean it to sound that way, but in retrospect, I realized it probably did. That was not my intention. But I'm just really, really impressed with what he says. Final quotation I will read from the Kuma. In its political aspect, philosophical consciencism is faced with the realities of colonialism, imperialism, disunity, and lack of development. Singly and collectively, these four militate against the realization of a social justice based on ideas of true liberty. So much as critical pedagogy was the development of Marxism in the context of Latin America, consciencism is the development of a similar idea, consciencism, not in Latin America, but in Africa. And we can still see the parallels. That's not to say that we can collapse Africa into Latin America or vice versa. To do so would be extraordinarily disrespectful to both. No two places or regions or ideas or people should ever be collapsed into another. Each one should be understood, studied, evaluated, and appreciated above all on its own merits. And I think that is the real brilliance, as I see it, of both critical pedagogy and consciencism. I think they both convey a very similar type of liberation. Okay, let's go on through a few more. Next one, liberation Buddhology. Buddhology, what is Buddhology? Most people don't use that word. Not a very common word, although I, as a sociologist of religion, I use it because we use it in the sociology of religion. Buddhology is a term that is sometimes used by people who ordinarily might be seen as Buddhist theologians. And in fact, some people do call themselves Buddhist theologians. So that term is not totally out of use. But the problem with using the word theology is that theology comes from two roots. One, theo, from theos, which means God, and the other, logi, from logos, which can be translated in many ways, including as a conversation, a discourse, a dialogue, and in the New Testament, it is translated as the Word, which is also a valid translation of logos. Logos is the root of the word logic. So some people translate logos as logic. That's okay too. I don't like it as much, but that's okay. So, okay, so you can say, if you wanted to, I guess, engaged Buddhist theology, but it's not usually called that. It's usually called engaged Buddhology or liberation Buddhology. That makes more sense. It is very similar to liberation theology, which we have already discussed, except it focuses upon Buddhas and how we can be emancipated through Buddhists. Now, I am not a Buddhist. I have some knowledge of Buddhism, but I am by no means an expert in the subject. I've known experts over the years. I've also known pretend experts over the years, one in particular. But regardless, the idea of what is Buddhism and how it relates to God is a controversial issue. Because again, with the exception of 4 Buddhist denominations, there's no concept of God in Buddhism. And all 4 of those denominations started in the 20th century. So they are innovations. They are not really a part of historical Buddhism. They began for a wide variety of reasons. Principally, I think, the interaction of the East with the West. Most Buddhists did not believe in God. Most Westerners at that time might have. So what are you going to do? Well, some Buddhists said, well, let's figure out a way to have a God in Buddhism. And that's what they did. And each of those 4 denominations, for lack of a better term, came up with their own way of doing it. But let me give you an example of how this liberation Buddhology might work in practice. In Pure Land Buddhism, it's a wonderful branch of Buddhism. Even as somebody who is not a Buddhist, I appreciate Pure Land Buddhism. It is based on the idea of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is somebody who is striving toward enlightenment. And that Bodhisattva is assumed to have a Pure Land. Each Bodhisattva has her or his own Pure Land. And whether it is her or his can vary. For example, the same Bodhisattva in Sanskrit that is male becomes female in Japan and China, which is kind of odd, but that's the way religions work. When you study religions, you get used to that kind of thing. That's very common. Changes in gender and all that stuff happen all the time. So the idea of Pure Land Buddhism is that by becoming attached to a particular bodhisattva, which is kind of like a Buddha, which is really an awakened one, literally translates as an awakened one. One can, when one dies, end up in that bodhisattva's Pure Land, like heaven. So you will be in that bodhisattva's heaven. That's the basic idea behind it. So from a spiritual standpoint, one can look at the way in which Pure Land Buddhism, which I think is, in my opinion, the best example of this, operates and has been constructed, and see how a type of spiritual liberation is emphasized in Pure Land Buddhism. Now, let me read you a series of 4 quotations which elaborate upon other aspects of liberation Buddhology. As an institutional separation, though, this situation recognizes a state of affairs from which my own vantage point I'd characterize as the recognition that most Western activists, he's talking about Western activists who call themselves Buddhists that most Western activists are not Buddhists. In other words, they may say they're Buddhists, but they're not really Buddhists, in his view. And most Western mediators are not Marxists. That I would take issue with, but anyway. I guess as a Western mediator. At least initially then, liberation Buddhology makes little sense as a proposition that all Buddhists should take a particular political line or engage in particular kinds of political action, or that all activists should become mediators. Next quotation. The Buddhist Marxism Alliance was founded by the Oxford Collective, and I have a link to that. If you go here, you can follow that link. On the 20th of July, 2013, in Oxford, UK. Its primary mission is to emphasize the similarity and compatibility of the Buddhist teachings with those of classical Marxism, and to assert that both systems of thought are motivated by compassion for the suffering of humanity. That's important. And emphasize a method of escape from that suffering. Buddhism and Marxism share a common philosophical grounding that is dynamic, ingenious, and transformative. The transformation on the individual develops society, and the transformation of society develops the individual. Buddhism and Marxism arrive at exactly the same conclusions, but through diverse and yet complementary pathways. Next quotation. Both Buddhism and Marxism are based on a philosophical rather than a theological view of the human situation, and both envisage the future in terms of cells of growth points, characterized by the respective principles of corporate existence, which each sets out, and devoted to the dissemination of these principles in theory and action. Both envisage a state in which the growth of these revolutionary cells will enable the center of political and economic power to be brought within the revolutionary system. Okay. Now, last quotation. In sum, the Buddhist prescription for personal happiness lacks one key ingredient: an understanding of the relative durable social conditions that block our ability to limit suffering and live happy, fulfilled lives. At the same time, the Marxist vision of an ideal society elides the obdurate existential facts of human suffering, yet both perspectives also provide us with valuable insight about how all human beings can attain a good life. Okay, so what we see there, I think, is an attempt to expand the idea of compassion in Buddhism. Compassion has generally been understood, I guess, in a more spiritual sense, like I love you, I love my neighbor, I try to behave in a good way. But if I add the Marxist ingredient to it, I can actually say, well, how can I love my neighbor? By being a revolutionary, by working for a communist society. That is truly loving my neighbor. So, for obvious reasons, this type of Buddhism is, liberation Buddhism is controversial, along with its close cousin, engaged Buddhism. Both very controversial. Because what they do is they take people, in the minds of some Buddhists, not all, but some, out of the practice of meditation and into the practice of focusing on the suffering of the world. And Buddhists historically have focused themselves primarily on meditation. The most well-known school of Buddhism in the Western world is, of course, Zen, which in China was called Chan, but the same school. And in India was called Dhyana, which was not exactly the same, but at least linguistically, that is the source of Chan and Zen. Chan and Zen both emphasize abstracting oneself from the outside world. I attended one time a Zen, I guess you would call it a workshop or a seminar. This is a long time ago, back when I was living in Macon, Georgia. And the people who came down to deliver this seminar came down from someplace in North Carolina. I don't remember which place. But they practiced a particular type of Zen. There are many types of Zen. Zen is not a single thing, called Soto Zen. And admittedly, till this day, I cannot say that I understand it. I respect the followers of religions, whether I understand them or not. That is not a precondition or a prerequisite for respect for me. I have no right not to respect people. Literally no right. But what we did in this Soto Zen seminar is, for the first part, we sat facing a wall, right up against the wall, with our legs folded, not in a kind of lotus position, pure lotus position, which is common in some schools of Vedanta or Hinduism, which I can still do, by the way. I learned it when I studied to be a yoga teacher. So at almost 68 years old, I can still do a full lotus, but full lotus is not required for this. You just sit with your legs crossed and you simply stare at the wall. Period. Period. That's it. You stare at the wall. Then, after a certain time has passed, which honestly seemed like an eternity to me, but it was probably more like 45 minutes. We got up and we formed a circle and walked around in a circle. That's Soto Zen. Do I understand that? No. There are no koans in Soto Zen. That's Shinzai Zen. In Shinzai Zen, they have koans, which are those strange riddle type expressions that you're expected to figure out. And believe it or not, in Shinzai Zen, there is a correct answer and an incorrect answer. It's not like just for your own reflection. Your Zen teacher measures your progress on the path of Zen by how you respond to the koan. But again, in Soto Zen, no koans. So I ended the day trying to think what I had learned from this experience. And with all due respect to anybody who may be watching me right now, whom I respect immensely, I couldn't think of anything. If some of you, if any of you watching has some idea of what I was supposed to learn and obviously did not learn, please leave it in the comments section. Or better yet, write a response video and I'll watch it, very intently watch it, because I would really like to know what I went through in that seminar. I don't know. I don't know what I was supposed to learn. I guess it was a way of achieving mindfulness, I guess, but I didn't achieve mindfulness from it. I just achieved boredom. So again, not to offend anyone. Maybe I have offended some people, but that's not my intention. But I was bored. I mean, that I'm being honest. The only experience I had was boredom. Not mindfulness, not compassion, which are the basic, or at least two of the basic characteristics in all schools of Buddhism. And I did not get that from those two practices that I engaged in Soto Zen. And to my understanding, those are the two major practices in Soto Zen. So, I mean, I was not considering becoming a Zen Buddhist. I already had my own religion and still have it. But if I were considering to become one, I would not have become one after that, because literally I learned nothing from it. Okay, one more. That's it, I promise. One more third worldism. This is called post-colonial theory. Now, let me start by giving you a brief critique of that from my perspective. The post in post-colonial theory should be a clue as to what it is. Meaning, it looks at colonialism through the eyes of post-structuralism, which we talked about in an earlier video today, and postmodernism, which is basically a rejection of the Enlightenment. And it tries to say, well, look, in order for people who have been colonized, whether they are still colonized or whether they are formerly colonized, what do they need to do? So when I first read about this many years ago, I thought post-colonial meant that it referred to people who were colonized but were no longer colonized. No, that's not true. Post-colonial is a hybrid of post-structuralism and postmodernism with colonial. That's what it is. It has nothing to do with after colonialism, which is what I assumed that it did have something to do with. Let me go ahead and read you my preface to it. Some of you may be familiar with this without knowing that you are familiar with it, because the ideas are pretty widespread, even if the term post-colonial may not be that widespread. Frantz Fanon, I love saying that. I love French. Frantz Fanon was one of the great figures in post-colonial theory. Edward Wadi Said, which is, I think, pretty good Arabic pronunciation of his name. is another major figure in post-colonial theory. Okay, and there are many others. I have a whole list of people here. If you go to this page, you will see it. You will be confronted with links. In terms of Fanon, the best known book by Fanon, which deals with post-colonial theory, is his book, The Wretched of the Earth. If you have not read The Wretched of the Earth, which you can find online, not hard to find, I suggest you read it. I think it's a very important book to read because it is an approach to third worldism. It's different than my approach, but that's not to say it's not complementary. I mean, saying that I'm a Maoist third worldist doesn't mean I can't borrow from other perspectives. I do. And so what? I think that's good. That's not, I mean, the way in which knowledge works is through cross-fertilization. We learn from each other. One person knows one thing, someone else knows something else. We exchange that knowledge, and we are both better off as a result of it. So let me read you what I wrote here. This perspective on colonized indigenous peoples was influenced by certain forms of critical social theory, which is a kind of approach to theory which combines social theory, which is social explanation, with the critical aspect, which refers in this case to Marxist, although it doesn't have to refer to Marxist. Critical social theory has tended to be ontologically idealist, which is why I generally stay away from most of it. I do use some critical social theory, but I do so with a considerable degree of caution. Okay, so let me continue that. In fact, let me start at the beginning of the paragraph where also it won't make any sense. This perspective on colonized indigenous peoples was influenced by certain forms of critical social theory, including Antonio Gramsci's cultural hegemony, as well as by other perspectives. It examines the impact of colonialism on the marginalization or othering, dehumanization, and alienation, estrangement or separation of the self of colonized peoples. One of the classic works of post-colonial theory is Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Post-colonial theory can also be referred to as post-colonialism or post-colonial studies. There is an organization which is devoted to post-colonial studies. It is referred to as the Post-Colonial Studies Association. So I imagine if you Google that, you'll find it, but also the link is right here in this book. So, okay, that's about it. This has gone on for a really long time. Honestly, much longer than I thought it would go on. I did not expect to talk this long. I thought I would finish this much more quickly than I did, but so be it. I hope it was beneficial to you. I know about the subject because I am a sociologist. I am a social theorist, so I study social theory. I am a Maoist third worldist. And so I not only have I tried to understand Maoism, third worldism, which I'm relatively new to, at least this time around, but I've also tried to understand other types of third worldism, like the ones that we just discussed, and to try to incorporate them on occasion with Maoism, third worldism. So I'm definitely not an absolutist when it comes to third worldism, meaning I don't have an idea that my own particular perspective. I'm going back right now to the actual interface for my my podcast. I do not expect any of you to agree with anything I've said. I don't necessarily agree with everything I've said. I've just attempted to provide a brief summary of some of the basic perspectives that are a part of this broad field, which is generally referred to as third worldism. For now, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.